Machiavellianism. Let's start with one of the darkest traits of all, Machiavellianism. The word comes from Niccolò Machiavelli, a 16th century political strategist who openly advised rulers to lie, manipulate, and exploit to keep power. Today, psychology uses the term to describe people who treat life like a chessboard, moving others around to serve themselves. Unlike impulsive anger or reckless cruelty, Machiavellians are cold planners. They don't just lie on the spot, they scheme. Research shows they score very low on empathy, but high on analytical thinking. This mix lets them stay calm while others get emotional, making them masters of deception. Surveys estimate nearly 15% of corporate leaders show elevated Machiavellian traits, which partly explains why toxic workplaces feel like survival games. But Machiavellian behavior isn't limited to offices or politics. In personal life, these individuals often fake intimacy, gaslight, or guilt trip to get what they want. They view morality as flexible. Rules apply until they get in the way of winning. Short-term, this strategy often works. History is full of leaders and con artists who rose fast through cunning tactics. But the long-term cost is high. Relationships collapse, trust evaporates, and reputations crumble once people see the pattern. Studies even show high Machiavellianism correlates with lower life satisfaction, because human connection becomes almost impossible. So here's the bottom line. Machiavellians may win elections, promotions, or short victories, but in the bigger picture, manipulation usually undermines the very empire they work to build. Narcissism. It's one of the most famous and disturbing, dark personality traits. The name comes from Narcissus in Greek mythology, a man so obsessed with his reflection that he wasted away staring at it. In psychology, narcissism goes far beyond vanity. It's marked by grandiosity, self-absorption, and a striking lack of empathy toward others. There are two core types. Grandiose narcissism looks like arrogance, dominance, and an obsession with power and admiration. Vulnerable narcissism hides behind insecurity. These individuals crave validation, but crumble when criticized. Either way, the world feels like a stage, and everyone else becomes the supporting cast. Studies show narcissistic traits exist along a spectrum. In moderation, they can even fuel ambition or resilience. But at the extreme, narcissism becomes destructive. Research finds that narcissistic leaders often engage in unethical behavior, put profit above people, and are significantly more likely to create toxic workplaces. In relationships, they manipulate through gaslighting, guilt, or charm, often leaving partners drained and devalued. One striking stat. Surveys suggest about 6% of U.S. adults meet criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, but many more show subclinical traits. Social media culture may even be making it worse. Constant likes, filters, and public performance reward self-image over authenticity. The short-term advantage? Narcissists often shine in first impressions. Their confidence and charisma pull people in. But the long-term outcome is usually collapse. Trust erodes, friends and partners leave, and reputations decline once the mask slips. In simple terms, narcissism builds castles of glass, dazzling on the surface but fragile underneath. And when it shatters, it takes relationships, communities, and sometimes whole organizations down with it. Psychopathy. Again, one of the darkest traits in human psychology. It's defined by coldness, impulsivity, lack of remorse, and sometimes a disturbing thrill in cruelty. Unlike most traits, psychopathy has been studied for decades through clinical tools like the Hare Psychopathy Checklist, used in prisons to measure levels of callousness and manipulativeness. Here's what sets psychopaths apart. They show a severe lack of empathy. Brain imaging even reveals reduced activity in the amygdala, the region tied to fear and empathy. This neurological difference helps explain their emotional numbness. Combine that with impulsivity, and you get people who can hurt others without guilt, then move on as if nothing happened. Statistically, only about 1% of the general population meets criteria for psychopathy, but estimates jump to 15 to 25% in prison populations. And not every psychopath is violent. Some channel these traits into high-risk careers like business, law, or politics, where charm, fearlessness, and ruthlessness can be assets. That's why you'll sometimes hear the phrase, successful psychopath. But the darker side is chilling. Psychopaths frequently engage in con artistry, abusive relationships, and repeated criminality. Studies show they're 3 times more likely to reoffend after release from prison, because remorse and moral learning rarely sink in. Relationships also suffer. Partners and friends often describe being exploited, manipulated, and discarded. The short game looks powerful. Psychopaths exude confidence, can be magnetic in charm, and seize opportunities others hesitate to touch. But the long game is bleak. Broken trust, legal downfall, and social isolation catch up. In short, psychopathy may look like fearlessness from the outside, but underneath, it's a vacuum. No conscience, no empathy, and often no lasting peace. Sadism. Another chilling dark trait because it's defined by something deeply disturbing, finding pleasure in the pain, humiliation, or suffering of other people. While other dark traits exploit or manipulate for gain, sadism creates harm simply for enjoyment. The concept originated with the 18th century French writer the Marquis de Sade, whose name became synonymous with cruelty for pleasure. In modern psychology, sadism is studied both in extreme violent offenders and in everyday behavior. In fact, research on what's called everyday sadism shows that ordinary people can sometimes enjoy things like trolling online, humiliating rivals, or violent entertainment. Small but revealing echoes of the same drive. Neurological studies show sadistic behavior lights up reward centers in the brain, meaning some individuals literally feel pleasure when others suffer. That makes sadism uniquely dangerous because punishment or empathy training often has little effect. The harm itself is the reward. Severe sadism is rare in the general population, but it shows up disproportionately in violent criminals and serial offenders. Research suggests over 90% of sadistic violent offenders reoffend because the drive isn't practical, it's addictive. But milder forms appear more often than you'd expect. Surveys estimate about 5 to 6% of people consistently report enjoying cruelty in non-criminal ways, especially in anonymous settings like gaming or social media. The consequences are serious. Sadistic behavior erodes trust, breeds fear, and can escalate from minor humiliation tactics to real violence. In relationships, it often means emotional abuse disguised as jokes or deliberate degradation. Bottom line, sadism isn't just darkness, it's darkness as entertainment. And when cruelty itself feels like pleasure, the lines between human and predator blur in terrifying ways. Sociopathy/antisocial traits. It centers on one key pattern: a blatant disregard for rules, social norms, and the rights of others. Unlike Machiavellianism, which manipulates carefully, sociopathy is impulsive, reckless, and often aggressive. Psychologists sometimes place it alongside psychopathy under the umbrella of antisocial personality disorder, but the difference matters. Psychopaths are calculated and cold, while sociopaths tend to be erratic, exploding in anger, breaking laws, or lashing out without foresight. This instability makes relationships turbulent and work lives chaotic. Statistically, about 3 to 4% of men and 1% of women show significant sociopathic traits, though many never meet the full criteria for a disorder. Among prison populations, the rate is much higher, close to 40%. Drug abuse, unstable childhoods, and head injuries are often linked to the development of these traits. The impact is severe. Sociopaths often leave behind trails of broken trust, financial ruin, or violence. They may appear charming in bursts, but they lack consistency and commitment. The result is repeated conflict with law enforcement, constant tension in families, and a pattern of self-destruction. Short-term, sociopathy may make someone fearless or bold. Long-term, it isolates them as communities, workplaces, and loved ones eventually push them out. In simple terms, sociopathy burns bridges faster than it builds them, leaving behind chaos where stability should exist. Schadenfreude. It's a uniquely dark trait because it's not about direct cruelty. It's about enjoying someone else's misery. The word comes from German, Schaden meaning harm, and Freude meaning joy. It's that guilty little grin when a rival trips, or the secret satisfaction when someone who wronged you gets embarrassed. At mild levels, it's almost universal. Studies show that nearly everyone experiences Schadenfreude, even children as young as 4. But in its darker form, it becomes more than a fleeting feeling. It's a consistent mindset that celebrates downfall and seeks out others' failures as entertainment. Online trolling communities are powered by this dynamic, where mocking and humiliating strangers provides group bonding. Psychologists often divide Schadenfreude into 3 types: aggressive, rooted in hostility; competitive, wanting to see rivals lose; and moral, enjoying punishment of people we see as deserving. On the surface, it can feel harmless, but studies link high levels of Schadenfreude to prejudice, bullying, and the erosion of empathy. When someone constantly seeks delight in others' pain, compassion shrinks, and cruelty starts to feel justified. The long-term outcome? People driven by Schadenfreude often isolate themselves because those around them eventually sense the hostility. Communities built on collective humiliation tend to collapse, leaving bitterness behind. So while Schadenfreude is a flicker of darkness in all of us, when it becomes a habit, it corrodes empathy and turns life into a spectator sport where suffering is the main show. Misanthropy means deep hatred or distrust of humanity as a whole. Instead of disliking an individual, the misanthrope sees people in general as selfish, cruel, or corrupt. The word comes from the Greek misos for hate and anthropos for humankind, literally, hatred of humans. Some turn to misanthropy after personal betrayals, war, or systemic injustice. It's often a defensive shield. Others adopt it philosophically. Famous thinkers like Schopenhauer and Diogenes expressed outright contempt for human nature, convinced society is driven by greed and hypocrisy. Misanthropy usually begins as cynicism, assuming the worst in others. But over time it grows into isolation, bitterness, and even justification for cruelty. Studies link strong misanthropic attitudes to higher hostility, social withdrawal, and reduced trust. In surveys, misanthropic worldviews predict lower well-being and weaker community ties because a person no longer sees cooperation as worthwhile. At its extreme, misanthropy fuels radical movements or lone wolf violence. History shows that when individuals or groups view humanity as irredeemable, they sometimes rationalize destruction as cleansing. Short-term, misanthropy may feel like protection against disappointment. Long-term, it traps people in loneliness and anger, reinforcing the very alienation they resent. Put simply, mistrusting everyone doesn't make you safe, it makes you a prisoner of your own hatred. Paranoia, malevolent suspicion, especially when focused on malevolent suspicion, is a dark trait that drives people to see enemies everywhere. It's not just caution, it's a chronic belief that others are plotting harm, lying, or scheming. Mild paranoia is surprisingly common. About 1 in 5 adults experience persistent suspicious thoughts, especially under stress or social pressure. But when it edges into pathology, it can form the backbone of paranoid personality disorder or paranoid delusions. In these states, people believe even neutral acts, a laugh, a glance, a silence, hide hostile intent. Paranoia often stems from a mix of genetics, early trauma, and insecure environments. Neuroimaging shows heightened activity in threat detection circuits like the amygdala, priming sufferers to interpret harmless events as dangerous. Evolutionarily, a degree of suspicion protected survival, but chronic paranoia becomes self-destructive. Interpersonally, it's corrosive. Paranoid individuals often alienate friends, accusing them of betrayal, or avoid communities entirely to stay safe. In groups, paranoia can fuel conspiracy theories, scapegoating, or persecution campaigns. Once suspicion spreads, trust collapses. Short-term, paranoia feels like vigilance. Long-term, it breeds isolation, hostility, and sometimes violent preemptive action against imagined threats. In essence, paranoia doesn't keep you safe. It locks you inside a hostile world of your own making. Vindictiveness/grudge-bearing. It's the obsessive need to get revenge, sometimes over the smallest of slights. Where most people feel hurt, process it, and eventually move on, vindictive personalities can lock onto a grievance for months, years, even decades. Psychologically, this is linked to high neuroticism and low agreeableness, but also a deep need for control. Research shows vindictive individuals have difficulty regulating negative emotions, so anger turns into obsession. They replay the insult over and over, feeding resentment until revenge feels like justice. Cultural surveys reveal how widespread this impulse is. About 25% of adults admit they've at least once tried to get deliberate revenge on someone. But for highly vindictive individuals, it becomes a lifestyle. They may sabotage coworkers, spread rumors, or even escalate into violence. The outcome is damaging both ways. On the surface, revenge gives a quick sense of satisfaction, but studies show it actually prolongs anger. The brain's reward systems are activated during retaliation, so the cycle becomes addictive. Long-term, vindictiveness erodes trust, drives people into paranoia, and often leaves them isolated as others withdraw to avoid being targeted. In simple terms, vindictive people don't just punish their enemies. They poison themselves by living in the past. Exploitativeness. It's the mindset that people exist purely as tools, to be used, manipulated, or discarded once they no longer serve a purpose. It's one of the unpleasant cores of narcissism and Machiavellian traits, but it stands alone as a dark behavior pattern. Exploitive personalities are experts at identifying vulnerabilities in others. They may flatter to gain trust, borrow resources without returning, or push emotional buttons to extract loyalty. Studies show individuals high in exploitativeness score extremely low in empathy and consistently higher in selfishness and entitlement. In the workplace, exploiters thrive on others' effort while dodging accountability. In relationships, they often drain partners emotionally, financially, or socially, leaving them exhausted. One study even found that exploitative people are significantly more likely to endorse unethical actions if it benefits them directly, regardless of harm to others. Short-term, this behavior can make someone appear successful. Promotions gained, wealth collected, influence expanded. But the long-term consequences are steep. Exploiters burn through networks, reputations, and trust, leaving people wary of associating with them. Ultimately, the very resources they rely on, community, connection, goodwill, dry up. The truth is this: exploiters always win in the moment, but over time, their strategy guarantees loss because nobody wants to remain a pawn forever. Cruelty, instrumental or gratuitous. Another one of the starkest signs of darkness in human behavior. It's the deliberate choice to inflict harm, not for survival or defense, but for power, control, or even enjoyment. Psychologists divide cruelty into two kinds. Instrumental cruelty is calculated, hurting someone as a means to an end, like intimidation or punishment. Gratuitous cruelty is different. It's harm for its own sake, where suffering itself is the reward. Sadly, history is full of cruelty, from public executions to torture to bullying that escalates simply because the perpetrator enjoys dominance. Research shows cruelty often spikes in groups, when individuals feel anonymous or shielded from accountability. This is why mob violence and online harassment can become so vicious. Personal responsibility fades, and harming others feels easier. Brain studies reveal some people even show increased activity in reward centers when watching suffering, linking cruelty directly to pleasure pathways. This is horrifying, but explains why some keep escalating harm. It feels gratifying. The long-term cost of cruelty is devastating. Victims suffer trauma, fear, and alienation. But perpetrators also corrode their empathy and relationships, losing the ability to connect authentically. Communities collapse when cruelty is normalized because trust and safety vanish. At its core, cruelty signals a collapse of humanity. It's not just darkness. It's the decision to make suffering a form of entertainment or power. Moral disengagement, the psychological escape hatch that lets people commit atrocities while still seeing themselves as good. Instead of admitting harm, they reframe it as necessary, righteous, or someone else's fault. The term was popularized by psychologist Albert Bandura, who studied how ordinary people can override their moral compass. He identified mechanisms like euphemistic language, calling torture enhanced interrogation, or displacement of responsibility, claiming "I was just following orders." There's also dehumanization, where victims are seen as less than human, making cruelty easier to justify. A chilling example: soldiers in war, corporations abusing workers, or extremists attacking civilians often use moral disengagement to see themselves as protectors or heroes. Once belief reshapes reality, even horrific acts feel justified. Studies confirm this defense works frighteningly well. In one survey, people who scored higher on moral disengagement admitted they were more willing to cheat, bully, or lie, especially when they thought their group benefited. It's not just extreme cases. Workplace politics, online hate, or even schoolyard bullying often rely on the same rationalizations. The danger is clear. Moral disengagement silences empathy and shields perpetrators from guilt. Short-term, it enables people to act with shocking boldness. Long-term, it perpetuates cycles of violence and corruption because no one feels truly responsible. In essence, moral disengagement is the story the mind tells to turn cruelty into duty and atrocity into virtue. Authoritarian sadism. It blends two dark urges, the hunger for control and the pleasure of punishment. It shows up when someone craves rigid authority over others, but doesn't stop at order. They want to dominate, intimidate, and make others suffer under their rule. You can see it in abusive bosses who enforce trivial rules just to break spirits, or in authoritarian regimes where obedience is demanded through fear. Studies have found a strong overlap between authoritarianism and sadistic tendencies. The more someone values strict dominance hierarchies, the more likely they are to enjoy inflicting pain on those beneath them. One survey revealed that individuals scoring high in authoritarian sadism were more likely to support extreme punishments and human rights violations, not because it's necessary, but because they believe people deserve it. This creates a cycle where cruelty is masked as discipline, and brutality is disguised as justice. The impact is far-reaching. Families, workplaces, and nations under authoritarian sadists often collapse into cultures of fear, where creativity, trust, and freedom vanish. The short-term effect is control. People fall in line. The long-term effect is rebellion, trauma, and social decay. In essence, authoritarian sadism doesn't just enforce order. It weaponizes power to crush, humiliate, and dominate. Callousness, extreme lack of empathy. It's another emotional numbness taken to the extreme, a near-total absence of compassion. Where most people wince at someone else's pain, callous personalities feel little to nothing. Psychologists link callousness to early developmental issues like neglect or trauma, but also to genetic factors. Brain scans show that individuals with callous unemotional traits have reduced activation in empathy circuits, especially when viewing images of suffering. This explains why they don't flinch when others hurt. In children, early signs can be frightening: cruelty to animals, lack of guilt, or complete indifference to punishment. Left unchecked, these patterns can develop into antisocial disorders in adulthood. In fact, callous unemotional traits are one of the strongest predictors of repeat violent offending. But callousness doesn't always mean violence. In everyday life, it shows up as coldness, ignoring distress, dismissing feelings, or exploiting weakness without hesitation. These individuals can be high-functioning, even charming, but emotionally detached in ways that corrode trust. The long-term consequences? Callous individuals may achieve short-term goals without guilt, but their relationships and leadership crumble. Communities can't thrive under people who literally feel nothing for others. Put simply, callousness is humanity with the empathy switch turned off, leaving a shell that seeks gain while others bleed. Thanatophilia, obsession with death and destruction. It refers to an obsessive fascination with death, decay, and destruction. Unlike simple curiosity about mortality, this trait reflects a dark pull toward annihilation, finding beauty or meaning in ruin. The term is rooted in psychoanalytic theory, sometimes connected to Freud's idea of the death drive, an unconscious push towards self-destruction. In practice, thanatophilia can appear in people who romanticize violence, collect morbid imagery, fantasize about catastrophe, or dwell endlessly on apocalyptic themes. Historically, this obsession has fueled destructive cults, extremist ideologies, and even mass violence. When glorification of death merges with ideology, tragedy follows, from terror attacks justified as cleansing acts to leaders mesmerized by war as a form of renewal. In milder forms, fascination with death shows in dark art, horror, or subcultures where decay and ruin are aesthetic themes. While not always pathological, these expressions can blur into unhealthy preoccupations when they glorify destruction over life. Psychological studies connect thanatophilia with higher aggression, depression, and nihilism. In one survey of extremist writings, death was framed not as an end, but as a reward or ultimate solution, highlighting the danger of this mindset. The long-term danger is clear. When death becomes a fixation, life itself is devalued. People swept up in thanatophilia see ruin as meaningful and survival as optional, a perspective that corrodes hope, responsibility, and a will to build. In short, thanatophilia turns what most people fear into obsession, fueling ideologies and acts where destruction feels more appealing than creation.